Hello there, and warmest greetings to you as I extend a welcome to you to this platform, Just a Few, which allows me the opportunity to provide biblical responses to questions from people just like you. As always, if you have a question and you'd like for me to attempt an answer to that question, if I can, please submit the question via email. The email address is on the screen, and I'll provide you a response as soon as I can. Today's question has to do with a particular verse in the New Testament, which people often quote. Sometimes even non-Christians quote it, even though it was written pertaining to Christians. Let's see what the question says, and then I'll get to the verse itself. The question is, do all things really work together for good? And the question is asked from the perspective of tragedies and the evils we see in our society and in the wider world. Can we really say that these things are working together for good? This statement is usually taken as a quotation, and we'll have to examine if we are quoting Paul, the Apostle Paul, accurately. It's usually taken as a quotation from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans. So let me look at that verse first, and then I'll try to give a bit of perspective on what the Apostle Paul is saying. It says in Romans 8:28, and we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Not just called, but the called according to his purpose. Let me say that this verse is not meant to teach that the way things occur and function in the world, in the universe, regardless of what we do, that something good will always come out of it. The reality is that this is not always the case. So are you thinking, am I contradicting the Apostle Paul? No, I'm not. For instance, a drunk driver crosses the median of a busy highway and plows into an oncoming vehicle going the opposite direction, killing all of the occupants in that vehicle. Can we tell that person, don't worry, all things are working together for good? Certainly not. What about when Adam and Eve sinned and the effects their sin had and continues to have upon humanity? Can we just say, well, all things are working together for good? Well, some people might say, well, ultimately, we'll see how it's working together for good. But we need to be careful here and understand what the Apostle Paul was saying in the context of this passage. Things don't simply work together for good by themselves. Everything is just somehow wired, if I may use that term, to just produce good. As the newer versions of the English Bible renders this verse, you'll realize that it is God who causes all things, and you need to understand what he means by all things. In his sovereignty, in God's grace, he causes all things for the ones to whom Paul was writing when he says, we know. Who's the we? He's writing to believers who he refers to as the called according to his purpose. And he's talking to them there about the trials and the sufferings and so on. Even all of creation is groaning. But despite all that we see in the natural, God is somehow going to weave his purposes together to bring about some good. But without God, it's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen automatically, that everything is just working for good. Life is not that way. So it is God in his sovereignty and in his grace who causes all things to work together for good for certain people. And we need to see for whom. So God is the one who, if he chooses to, will make things turn out for our good. He does this not because of us, but very often in spite of us. And let's look at one of the more new versions of the English Bible, the New Living Translation. Here in the second edition of the New Living Translation, it says this: "And we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God." Notice how it's better put here, the construction. It's not for good, but for the good of those who are called according to God's purpose for them. So we need to understand what this is saying here, and that we just don't quote a verse because it's sounding good without realizing the context and what the writer intended. Notice also that God does, who God does this for. He does this for those who demonstrate their sincere love for Him. And without seeing it in the verse, how do you do that? By trusting Him regardless of the circumstances that you find yourself in, and obeying Him. Trust Him. That's how you show your love for Him. Trust Him, obey Him. And it's for those people that God is working and bringing and causing all things to work together for their good, as well as for those who are functioning in His purpose for their lives. So if you're living contrary to God's purpose for your life, you dare not go quoting this verse and say, well, I'm living in sin, but God causes all things to work together for good. No, there are consequences for our actions. And God may not cause it to work together for your good when you act in disobedience to Him and when you rebel against His purpose for you. So one cannot live in rebellion to God and expect to claim this verse as some sort of universal principle. Also, if you have not responded in faithful obedience to God and to His call to submission to His will, you too cannot expect to see all things in your life working together for good. God does this for those who meet these two criteria. If you love God and you trust Him, obey Him, no matter what happens, you trust Him. You don't question His will, you don't rebel against it, and you live according to His purpose for your life. That's what Paul is saying. So, and the reason why God does that for those people is because of His grace, His providence, His sovereignty, and He does it in the lives of those who align themselves with His mysterious but marvelous purposes. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is a good example of this. When the angel Gabriel appeared to her and told her something, she couldn't understand that she was going to conceive this child even though she wasn't sexually involved. But that was God's purpose for her. He had called her to serve Him in that capacity. And look at what she said. The angel said, when Mary was at first questioned in verse 37 of Luke 1, the angel says, "For with God nothing will be impossible." Then Mary said, "Behold, the maidservant of the Lord, let it be to me according to your word." And then the angel departed. Mary had that submissive spirit, and all things did work together for good for her, despite the initial fallout of people questioning how could she be pregnant. And so that's an example of someone who submitted to the will of God. And for people who love, trust, and obey God and submit to His will, God causes all things in those people's lives to work together for their good. And that's what this verse means from the Apostle Paul. My name is Patrick Antoine. Trust my explanation helped in some way, and thank you again for the question. So until the next time, grace and peace be multiplied to you.